Good morning. Happy Memorial Day weekend. I am going to do my makeup while I make this video. See all these videos of women doing their makeup? Bailey Sarian, Haley Elizabeth. Personally, I don't like being on camera. It makes me nervous, so having something to do with my hands helps. And plus, I guess it's more interesting visually for the viewer than me just sitting and talking. I have some topics for today's video. I want to just say, like I do every Memorial Day weekend, rest in peace, Matthew Morelli. Matthew Morelli was a cop who shot himself in his patrol car the first week that I was a police reporter. He was also a veteran. God bless his soul. I have discovered a book. My friend is getting it for me. It's on its way, hopefully. It's called Sexy But Psycho. It's by a doctor of psychology named Jessica Taylor. She's a British woman. I find that the British people are a little bit ahead of the curve when it comes to these issues. But it is a debunking of one of my diagnoses, borderline personality disorder, in the context of violence against women. Her argument is that women who have been abused often end up with this diagnosis because they are exhibiting very normal, very natural responses to abuse in a system that continuously invalidates them, and therefore they're being pathologized and classified as mentally ill, and there is ultimately no accountability for that as long as the diagnosis exists. In fact, one of the points that she made in a podcast on the Mad in America channel, which is how I learned of this book, was that for all this progressive talk and delusional talk, in my opinion, about removing the stigma around mental illness, there's no point in teaching people to remove stigma and bias against mentally ill people if the diagnoses themselves are stigma. So, something to think about. I have been thinking about how the mental health industry, has repackaged and rebranded and expanded the borderline diagnosis. It used to be the case that when you would look it up, there would be all of these archetypes, frankly, that exist in literature and fairy tales about women. So you might be a witch, you might be a hermit, you might be a queen, you might be a waif. And it's really quite a catch-all diagnosis for anyone female. And there is no evidence to support that people are born with these kinds of brains, that it's genetic. In fact, 2 days ago, I watched a video by this man named Dr. Fox, who's a specialist in it out of Texas, and he was explaining something or other about BPD, and then at the very end of the video, he said 80 or 90% of mostly these women whom I treat have been abused. They are abuse victims, but he didn't really dwell on that because his entire career is predicated on treating an illness, and I guess there is no reason for him to re-examine that in the context of, well, is it an illness or is it injuries? And quite frankly, it makes me very furious. Now, what they have done with the diagnosis is try to deflect from the obvious sexism of the archetypal categories by creating a bunch of new subtypes: malignant, impulsive, petulant, quiet. It all kind of rests on and turns on the idea that there is some kind of ideal framework for a normal woman, and that it's such a catch-all that these subtypes can directly contradict each other, but you can still get slammed with it anyway. So when you have been abused, particularly if you've been subject to mental and emotional abuse, part of that is continuous gaslighting and crazy making. So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you are lashing out at others and having angry outbursts that others consider disproportionate, or your emotions are considered too intense vis-a-vis, I guess, normal people, I guess people who haven't had their asses kicked by, an intimate partner or been threatened or, God knows what, then, if you don't act normal following your abuse, then no matter what your response, you can still be considered mentally ill. It's really a fabulous way of discrediting victims. It's really perhaps the most crazy making, right? So then if you throw up your hands and say, well, I don't know, I disagree, then that also means that you're borderline, because borderlines reject the diagnosis and they reject therapy. If you stay in therapy and you don't reject this whole bullshit paradigm and you submit yourself like a typical submissive abuse victim to the care of others and try to fit in, if you happen to be needy or exhausting or annoying to your therapist, then that also could mean that you have no matter what you do, it's going to mean that you have borderline personality disorder. So you stay in therapy and you prove to be a difficult case, that means you're borderline. You leave therapy because you just can't get down with it, that means you're borderline. It's a rock solid system. It's beautiful. It's the most sophisticated catch-22 that I've seen since, I don't know, like looking at government corruption and just so many predatory financial behaviors that we have going on. It's beautiful. It's, wow. So basically, I think that I need to talk now about violence against women and my hospitalizations. And I will just go ahead and lay it out for you. The first time I was hospitalized, I was 16 years old. And I think that I was dealing with, or attempting at that time in my life, I didn't have a choice anymore. It just kind of had become incumbent upon me to process a lot of the abuse that I experienced, in particular before I was 5. And what was going on was, when I was growing up, my biggest fear in school was saying something stupid or getting in trouble And at home, my biggest fear was that my dad would kill my mom or my mom would kill me, because that would be her ultimate revenge against my father. So the way that I dealt with that was when I was in first grade, I was what we now call special needs, because for most of my kindergarten year, I was pretty spaced out. And they had to separate those of us with special needs and put us in a little class at school. And I also started being prescribed at this time decongestants because I had sinus issues that were aggravated by the fact that I had to visit my father's house where people smoked and it was filthy and it was squalid. But mostly it was the smoking. It would trigger my sinuses, and by the time I was in kindergarten, I started having these headaches, and I would cry, and then it would get worse, and I would bury my head in pillows and scream, and then they gave me a prescription for decongestants, which were stimulants, and ironically, what happened at school was all of a sudden my grades started getting way better, because I think that the stimulant aspect of the decongestants allowed me to focus. In many ways, this class of drugs is very similar to Ritalin and Adderall. I watched a documentary years ago about kids who were prescribed Ritalin from a very young age because their parents wanted them to perform well in school, and they were totally burned out and totally just strung out by the time that they were like ready to go to college. And that happened to me too, because these drugs, they're the kinds of drugs that you get them you can now buy them over the counter, Claritin, Sudafed, etc. And they say on the package, do not take this for more than 3 to 5 days. I took them for 15 years, and it stunted my growth, it delayed my puberty, and it's probably why I'm so short to this day. No one else in my family is this short. But it did really make me to the point that, I went from the kid who in first grade was considered so developmentally behind that she had to be in special ed, to the kid who in 7th, 8th, and 9th grade had the highest academic achievement, performance, whatever, for 3 years running. Just top of the class. So at any rate, what was going on when I was 16 was my way of coping with the abuse at home was to overachieve, because if I went to school, it was a place where, unlike at home, there was structure, there was rules, and people were pretty much fair to one another, and adults in charge were not arbitrary. And I tried to cope with the abuse at home by basically being very, very well behaved and achieving a lot, because I thought, here are these other adults, and if I do well, then maybe I can get them to love me and they will value me. And also, my parents, I did love them. They had it harder, in my opinion, than a lot of other people's parents. and they were working class, and they didn't make much money, and everybody else's parents were frankly doctors and lawyers, and I wanted to prove that they were just as good, and if I was as good as the other kids, well then I could just prove that. And I ended up covering for them. I ended up covering a lot, and I got to an age where I was really angry because my strategy had backfired on me. I had painted myself into a corner. I had become so high achieving and so normal that I realized that if I spoke about the things that were upsetting or damaging to me, it really didn't matter anymore to anyone. The only thing that mattered was keeping me going. And so I tried to do the opposite. I tried to refuse to go to school. I tried to quit functioning. And that's why I put myself in the hospital. I was attempting to process a lot of pain. I would spend hours crying and crying and crying and crying, and I couldn't explain exactly why, except that I wasn't allowed to cry when I was younger, so it has to come out somewhere. And I put myself in the hospital because, frankly, I thought these people will finally see. They'll finally see how abused I am at home. But no. Instead, what happened was they used medication to bring me out of that so they could spit me right back into the same family. And I know that at the time of this particular breakdown and hospitalization, that's when I got the borderline diagnosis. I was only 16. That's not allowed anymore. It's not considered medically ethical. You're not supposed to diagnose a teenager with it because apparently all teenage girls have. This should be telling. I mean, this should be really telling. You should really give some pause and thought to this. When you hear numerous psychologists and psychiatrists online say, well, we don't diagnose teenage girls with borderline, and because they're all borderline. I mean, really? Stop and think what this means. So anyway, I think I was attempting to process a lot of pain from my childhood, and it was interrupted by these professionals who A, didn't get it, didn't care, didn't think it qualified, didn't meet their needs, and were not nearly as empathetic as they seemed to think they were. So, yes, I still have anger and I still have resentment. For example, I have anger and resentment at having been diagnosed with an eating disorder that I never had. I watched a video made by a cop on Officer 401 channel. Yeah, okay. And he does these pretty candid and gritty videos from his patrol car, and one of them is titled "The Ugly Truth About Being a Cop." And I was touched. My heart was touched when he did that one, because he said, you're going to have to go and you're going to have to see things that you can't unsee. And he started talking about going into houses where there's so much filth and squalor and kids are still there, and there's like piss and shit on the floor and cockroaches everywhere, and you really don't even want to be in that house, much less live there. And that more or less was, he's describing conditions that were my father's house for many years. Okay. And I didn't live there full time until after I was hospitalized. But for years on end, because of my sinuses, when I would have to go visit him on the weekends, I would wake up every Sunday morning and all of the filth and all of the disgusting mildew, just the dirt, just people, addicts don't clean house. They don't really maintain very well. Okay, they don't. And my stepmother was a hoarder and an invalid. She lived on welfare and was diabetic and had grown up in that kind of condition, so she didn't know or do any better. And every single Sunday morning that I spent there twice a month for 5 years, I woke up, my sinuses had drained into my stomach, and there was so much mucus that I vomited for hours until there was literally nothing left in my stomach. And my stepmother and my stepfather treated it as this, just like, that's just what she does. I'm not kidding you. I never got like a glass of water or a wet washcloth. I did it all on my own, and then I went back to bed, and every single body in my family was just like, what are you gonna do? I told teachers about it. It didn't matter. It's really exhausting, and the supposition was, I guess, that I was making myself throw up, or that it was all in my head. It was psychosomatic. If you spent 2 nights and 2 days in that environment, you would vomit yourself, even without these sort of congenital sinus issues. Okay, I had a deviated septum, and I don't know when that was discovered, but I don't know when it was incurred. I don't know if I was born with it or if I got it later in life, but it doesn't help. So, all they did was put pills in me and tell me that I was sick. So when I came out of the hospital and I discovered that I had a quote unquote eating disorder because I was underweight, and I don't know what my family, it became a big cover story, right, for my father. She must be making herself do it. No one visited the house. No one bothered to investigate. Um, just, dear God, no, I'm not ill. I never thought I was fat. I never withheld food from myself. I never tried to control my body weight as a means of coping. I was not anorexic. So, in a way, it left a really bad taste in my mouth, because I saw the willingness of these professionals to collude with my abusive family and lie about me. And this is a constant pattern of invalidation for abuse victims. No, I never said that. No, she's making it up. It's because she's too sensitive. Da 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 da. After you have vomited your guts out for 5 years because you have no choice and no one will help you get to the bottom of it, including doctors, it makes you a little bit pissy. Okay, so then they put me on Prozac. Prozac made me manic, even psychotic. I literally was a virgin. I thought I was going to give birth to a child. I had to go to the ER. I had to take my mom to the ER after she tried to commit suicide because I had separated myself from her. Okay? And again, after all these events happened, I went back to school like a good little girl and continued to do the good little girl shit, and nobody said anything. Nobody was like, oh, hey, your mom tried to commit suicide and blamed you for it. Are you okay? No, not one person, not one teacher, not one of these paid professionals even bothered to reach out to me. None of the priests I grew up under, no one. Okay? Because why? Because I was doing so much better. I was doing so much better, right? I was back in class. I was turning in work again. I was making straight A's again. Yeah. So I would say that all the violence in my family, all of the abuse, the beatings my mom took in front of me, my stepmom, all of that, I was attempting to process some of that bullshit. And I had some early, what I thought were memories come up about my grandfather. I still to this day don't know. They're not as clear to me as other incidents, memories. And I cannot be clear on it because by that time the Prozac had kicked in and I was severely disinhibited. Okay? So, they took a very sensitive child who had been abused and used drugs to manipulate her behavior and then lied about it. They lied about what was causing it. They lied about the extent of the damage that the SSRIs did. To this day, I don't think I would have bipolar symptoms if I hadn't been exposed to the Prozac and the decongestants in combination. And both of them were prescribed by licensed medical providers who took my life out of context and decided to make me be ill and didn't care how much injury they were concealing. I wasn't paying the bills. My abusers were. Think about it. Okay, so that was the first hospitalization in 1997. A couple of years later, I went to college. My freshman year, I had an episode and I was sent to the ER, although I wasn't sent to the psych ward. I couldn't sleep. I was adjusting to the urban environment. I had moved from Lubbock, Texas to Boston, and my dad hit me the night before he dropped me off from college. Didn't hurt me, but it wounded me emotionally because I knew now I'm an adult woman and I'm going to be treated like the other adult women in my family. If he's willing to hit me now, God knows what I have in store for. And it was my grand debut, I was in college and I was going to be like on my own, sort of. So I did what I did and I sucked it up and I tried to go to class, but I was having a lot of issues around what had happened. And so, yeah, there was that one. Then I guess I had another panic attack and I was like dissociating and I ended up in the ER and the RA took me and then they brought me back. Again, everything was fine until 2001 when I decided I don't like being married. I got married at 19, changed schools, moved in with my husband. We had been married a year and a half. And I guess I didn't like it. I felt like the only thing I'd ever really wanted was to get free of my family, but in some ways, being dependent like a child and trying to go to school and living on my husband's income just sort of replicated. I just didn't like it. So I told my husband I don't want to do this anymore. I was already having issues. I was decongestant overdosing. I was trying to stay up and pull all-nighters. So yeah, I was a little bit manic, but in my mania, I really got to the bottom of how do I really feel about this, and then had the guts to do something about it. So I told my husband, I don't want to be married to you anymore, and then he threatened to kill me. And then, lo and behold, after going to a women's shelter, my PFA failing, trying to depend on relatives, I had another manic episode and ended up in the psych ward. And that's when I got slammed with the quote-unquote bipolar disorder diagnosis. Really what it is fight or flight behavior. Okay. So then let's just skip a whole bunch of years. Okay, years in which I've already talked about. I was fully medicated, didn't do very much, wasn't very stable, but managed to graduate college after changing 4 times the school that I went to. And then in 2012, was sexually assaulted by my roommate. And there's other videos about that. And then my point is, like, each and every time I would spend less and less time and need less and less meds. Then in 2014, there was a brief overnight stay. And that one, I don't really give a shit if you believe me or not. I really can't. I'm not going to talk about the circumstances leading up to that one because it's still probably not safe for me. Okay? But my point is, if the precipitating events of each of these hospitalizations and episodes actually constitute violence against women, then what are we actually doing here? And I have so much rage, so much frustration, so much resentment, and so much anger still, precisely because of what Dr. Jessica Taylor is talking about in her book, Sexy But Psycho. Because I know, and I'm talking about this because the police department that I've applied to, they want to see all the records, as did the Secret Service. I'll talk about that later. They want to see all the records. I don't even have all the records from my stays. The system wasn't even that transparent with me. When you get arrested, people actually read you something. It's called your Miranda rights. Anything you say can and will be used against you. When you are hospitalized and when you are treated by these professionals, there is no such thing as Miranda rights, even though everything that you say can and will be used against you in a system that is set up and designed purposefully to treat trauma and abuse victims as ill persons, not sane, not whole, not credible. With respect to the 2012 hospitalization and it being classified as an involuntary commitment, I don't think it will stand legally because commitment is a legal process where a judge typically decides that you are, mentally incapacitated. And I don't think that a person who goes through 48 hours of shock following a sexual assault really meets the legal standard for involuntary commitment. I mean, usually you have to demonstrate that you are a danger for yourself, danger to others, and I wasn't a danger. I was nonverbal. So there's this issue of, is it voluntary or not voluntary? Well, how can I how can I demonstrate that it's voluntary if I can't really talk, like, right in the moment, right in that very moment? I can't really talk. I mean, it's like the issue of consent. Have you ever had sex with a person who has not been capable of speaking or has been on drugs and otherwise, consent? right? Can't give consent if you are not talking. So then why should it be held against you? This is just a question to ask. So all that said, all these people are like, so the thing that makes me angry, back to the rage, anger, and frustration, is this. There will be people who will listen to what I have to say, people in the know, people that I've been studying, listening to for well over a year, people like Robert Whitaker, Joanna Moncrief, Peter Goetsch, James Davies, Jessica Taylor, and Laura Delano, who will understand because they are supporting and validating the psychiatric survivor movement. For example, Robert Whitaker's book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, talks about how 85% of people diagnosed with bipolar disorder were exposed to one of two things, maybe both, while their brains were still developing. Okay, this is scientific research. This is scientific data. This is not me making shit up to get you to feel sorry for me. 85% of people who are diagnosed with bipolar disorder were exposed to antidepressants or pot while they were still developing their brains. And in case you don't know, your brain is not done developing until you're 26 years old. And I already knew this because I had sat and listened to a psychiatrist actually do this CYA lecture on bipolar disorder and talk about how I suspect they've taken it out because of the liability issues. But I watched a man, a psychiatrist, talk about they created a bipolar 3 category. I was about 25 years old. It was 2006. So why did they create this category? They created it specifically for people who were given antidepressants while they were an adolescent and had an adverse reaction. But it used to be, it's still the case that if you have an adverse reaction, that the lying, corrupt hucksters, the vicious fucking parasites that these people are, will claim that if you have an adverse reaction to these antidepressants, if you go into mania, if you go into psychosis, it proves that you already had bipolar disorder and they just didn't catch it because they saw you when you were in a depressive phase. So notice that it doesn't, for instance, prove or suggest that these drugs are harmful or bad for kids, because that would get in the way of sales. And another thing about these drugs is there's some things that are called side effects and there's some things that are called adverse reactions. Adverse reactions are things that need to be looked at very carefully, okay? Because the adverse reactions are the things that are actually making people incur more diagnoses and continuing this chain of corruption, okay? So an adverse reaction is different from a side effect. Let's say that you have, let's say that you are on birth control or on a hormonal replacement. A side effect might be that you gain weight because whatever in the drug will act on your metabolism, whatever. Or a side effect of taking an antihistamine is that you become drowsy. A side effect is something that you're going to go through while on the drug, short term, and when you discontinue it, it should stop. What is an adverse reaction? Okay, an adverse reaction is something like when you take birth control and your body stops being able to produce those hormones on its own, and then when you discontinue it, your hormonal system is imbalanced or defective. So there's damage. Or if you take antihistamines long term, let's say, the adverse reaction might be that your immune system goes haywire, goes into overdrive. You start having a lot of other issues beyond the allergies that you were trying to control because you've disrupted the natural functioning of that particular system. This is how the psychiatric drugs work. They know this. This is known. This is well researched. It's just suppressed. It's not mainstream knowledge. Let's say that you take antidepressants and you may have an adverse reaction. Then you're bipolar. Then you're on mood stabilizers. The mood stabilizers, according to the work of Robert Whitaker and others, actually create alterations in your brain tissue such that you will have deepening and worse prolonged mood swings throughout the course of your life, which has the added benefit of making you, if you don't get off and you don't realize what's going on and you don't have the chutzpah to buck the system, it will make you drug dependent for the rest of your life. And then the side effects will eat your body alive. I have a friend, well, I had a friend, we're not friends anymore, but she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at the same time as me. She was having, she was from Indonesia. We were both at Bryn Mawr together. We were oddballs. We didn't fit in with the hoity-toity, uptight, sheltered population of other female students. So she was having a really tough time culturally adjusting to America from Indonesia. She was adjusting to the cold weather, all this different American ways of doing things. She would go to CVS and just be agog at the variety of shampoos. So, like, she would be like, look, there's a whole aisle of shampoos. She's like, CVS is my favorite store. Oh my God. So much to explore. She's like, in Indonesia, there's like 5. Another time we went to Bed Bath & Beyond, and she was really bummed that she couldn't, like, barter. Or not barter, but, like, haggle. You don't negotiate for prices because at the market in Indonesia, that's how you buy things. And I was like, baby, you can't do that here. There's, like, barcodes and shit. She would isolate herself in her dorm room. Her first roommate rejected her. She took that really hard. And she'd watched Friends. She'd binge eat and binge watch Friends for like hours. She'd eat a lot of ice cream. And I was like, what are you doing tonight? Like, what's going on? And, I realized that it was because in Indonesia, growing up, Friends was her favorite show, and it was comforting and familiar to her because Friends became somehow like her idea of America. So it was this portal, and then she comes to America, and guess what? Shit ain't like that. So she was doing stuff that I know now is cultural adjustment syndrome. Also, she had been raped when she was 11, so that might have had something to do with how she felt. And she ended up being on so many different meds. It was not even fucking funny. I've never seen anybody so, whoa. 5 years later, she's still trying to get through school, and she's incontinent at times because of the meds. She's gained like 50 pounds. She's also smoking weed on top of them, which I don't really recommend that you do that. That's a terrible idea. I don't understand the impetus to legalize this shit. I think we're playing with fire. I really do. It makes me absolutely sick to my stomach to see what's going on with that. Because we're going to have like generations of severely bipolar people from all of this bullshit. Okay, but anyway, now she's on Haldol. She lives in, she lives barely in this tiny little apartment that she can't afford because she's on disability. And the state had to eat $185,000 worth of her student loans because she went on to get a master's in social work from the same fucking expensive school, only to discover that she can't work because she can't read now. And she believed over time, what I watched happen with her was that the successive drugging and incapacitating of her would get so severe and it wasn't taking, and they would keep on with the diagnosing. No one ever said. I think what it is that you've experienced trauma, and now we don't know how much damage we've done, so they just kept piling on diagnoses. Dissociative identity disorder, schizoaffective disorder, blah, blah, blah. And now she's on Haldol, which is the first generation type drug that scares everybody. The only thing more scary than that is like Thorazine, and that's where we're headed. That's what happens. I have another friend whose sister just got prescribed Lamictal because she's now been decided at the age of 37, I don't even know, in her mid-30s, that she's bipolar, but when we were in college together, she had dysthymia. So she was on antidepressants. So there's a progression, there's a spectrum, there's a progression of damage done to these people. First, antidepressants. Second, mood stabilizers. Third, antipsychotics. And each and every time there's a rationale and an excuse. Each and every time there's a rationale and there's an excuse. So I'm gonna like wrap up here. I'm gonna say that the title of today's video will probably be, I will not help you discourage me. Why? In the back and forth that I had with this officer at the police department where I was applying, I started to have a lot of emotional flashbacks to when I was first diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Because the officer has to walk a fine line, okay? I can hear the fine line from having been around legal types. Right? I hear the fine line when it's coming through the phone. No one can tell me what you've been hospitalized, what you have this, what you took medication. No way, no how. We don't take crazy chicks here because the fine line is like, I want to say absolutely not. That's the psych evaluator's job. Because what if this person gets really vexatious and like comes back at us kind of lawsuit, and there's like, God, no. The same legal standards about like Americans with Disabilities Act and whatnot do not apply to these jobs. So I don't know what the caginess really. I told her, I said, I cannot stand on, rights that don't exist. don't exist. It's maddening trying to talk to my friends and family about it because they're like, ah, what? That's not fair. No, discriminate. I'm like, you. Oh, God. I'm like, it's law enforcement. It's not the same. It's not the same. It's literally not the same. So, what I was hearing was, this job is so ultra stressful. There's a lot of highs and lows. She kept using highs and lows. I'm like, maybe if you don't, okay. And it very much reminds me of when I was first diagnosed with bipolar disorder. When people told me I couldn't go back to school, I actually had an English teacher in high school basically tell me that I would never graduate college. I wasn't capable. I was mentally ill, right? I had people tell me I couldn't go back to school full time because it was too stressful. It was stressful, but not as stressful as growing up in a household like I did. Okay, people just don't fucking understand what they're talking about, and it's very patronizing, and it's ridiculous. There is nothing that you can do in life that is worthwhile that does not involve stress. So if the mental health care system isn't willing to restore a human being to the point where they can endure stress just like any other human being, they need to be held accountable for that. Okay? They need to stop fucking around and sucking up money and putting people on disability because it pays. They need to stop. It needs to stop. The lying, the cheating, the manipulating of data, the overtaking of regulators, and above all, the ruining of people's lives. Needs to stop. Needs to stop. One point that I raise about it all is that when you get diagnosed into this system, you think that you are being given prescriptions and a medical label that is, there's just talk about parity, mental health parity. We need to treat mental health on parity with physical conditions. I think that if the chemical imbalance theory is bullshit, and it's been proven to be so, and if they cannot pinpoint physical etiology for this shit, then they shouldn't be allowed to treat it on parity with physical conditions. Okay, because they can't prove it. I wasn't born this way. I wasn't born this way. This isn't illness. This is injury. This is sustained injuries over time. And people can heal from injuries. If I break your arm and then turn around and tell people it only happened because you have in your family line, like, you have like bone density problems, but I can't prove it, do I deserve to get off scot-free for breaking your fucking arm? No, I don't. That's called justice. I recently took myself out of therapy because I realized that I've been chasing healing. Because I've been told that I'm broken and damaged goods. And I need people to fix me. And I thought, well, I have all these life problems. I haven't done so well. So I'm broken and I'm damaged. And maybe this one will fix me and save me and make me whole, make me better. And I need to heal and heal. For years, I did watch like CPTSD videos, and some of them were helpful. I need to heal I need to make people understand I have complex PTSD, and I'm like fucking over it. I'm really fucking over it. The whole gamut of things, I'm over it. Because it sets me up. Oh, just chase healing, chase healing. What is it? What is healing? Can you tell me? And why should I, as a victim of trauma and abuse, set myself up for a lifetime of having to prove something that no one can really define for me? It's not fair. It's not right. So, what do I mean by I will not help you discourage me? The officer who informed me that I would have to pull all these records, open up, here are my dirty panties, smell them, look at them, what do you think about? And I will fucking do it, okay? The quiet BPD diagnosis is also known as discouraged BPD. Isn't that something? If you feel discouraged, if you're quiet, this is psycho. These people are psycho. Of course I'm discouraged. I spent 24 years of my life watching people get away with shit. And now people have decided that my discouragement might be mental illness. See, this is my point about the BPD diagnosis. I told you each and every time I'd ended up hospitalized, medicated, and I told you what happened before. But at least half of you will listen to this laundry list of things that are violence against women in origin, and you will decide that I am mentally ill, because these kinds of things, I would have to have been mentally ill in order to allow them to happen to me in the first place. So I've been hearing a lot of this, it can never happen. It will never happen. Everybody in my life, not just the officer. Officers, like, probably you will never be allowed to even have a firearm, so that's part of the job. And then I thought, well, what if I go to the academy on my own? I probably can't get into the academy because blah, 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 because this involuntary commitment. Which, as a person who's been threatened and beaten and gaslighted, and also had brushes with a criminal underclass that I can't really talk about, knowing that the system has effectively disarmed me if I wanted to carry doesn't make me feel any less discouraged. But I won't be quiet about it either. So what do you think that is? So when I'm hearing her say these things, I'm hearing in my head, I'm remembering being told, probably, you shouldn't get a divorce. You can't make that kind of decision for yourself right now. You're not really clear-headed, so you probably can't go back to school full time. It's gonna be too much for you, and you should probably work from home. There's articles about bipolar people, and they do better when they work from home because it's quiet and there's less conflict. A lot of this is limiting. It's a process of indoctrination when you get diagnosed. One of the first things that they teach you is that there is no cure for what you have. There's only treatments. And it took me almost 20 years to be able to say, why the hell not? You are the doctors. You are the scientists. Why the hell can't you cure it? That's what you're supposed to do with illnesses. And if you're not curing it, how well are you treating it? Not very well. We have epidemic rates of this shit. We have epidemic rates of people on disability for this shit. We have epidemic costs attached to this shit in real terms, in real dollars. And you don't yet see anybody like having a race for the cure. 5K! Cure bipolar disorder, do you? No, because nobody gives a shit. Some people know it's bullshit, so they don't care because they don't have to. Right? And other people, well-meaning people, they think they're doing their God's honest best by those of us who've incurred this, by being caring and understanding. But what they mean by caring and understanding is that they care and they understand about the exact same lies that have been repeated, the propaganda and the bullshit that's been dumped on them by one of our country's most profitable and corrupt industries. So what I want to say is I have a lot of work to do. I have to quit vaping. I have to make sure I can pass a stress test, and I have to get my credit score up so that the next time when I come paperwork in hand and they reject me anyway, they will know that it is possible for a person like me to get strong and to be resilient. They will know they've missed that much more. Happy Memorial Day. Rest in peace.